Lee Sigal lives in New York, and his office is at the Social Science Research Council there. He's devoted his career to nuclear arms control, including during the Carter administration working on what became the intermediate range missiles agreement, currently under threat. Since the end of the Cold War, however, Lee's primary focus has been on bringing North Korea in from the cold. He discovered this issue while he was writing foreign policy editorials for the New York Times. He started at the New York Times in 1989, when U.S. intelligence agencies were still debating whether that long building that had been constructed near a small reactor at Yongbyon was a plutonium separation plant. It turned out it was. He stayed on until 1995, after Jimmy Carter had facilitated an agreement to freeze North Korea's plutonium program. The U.S. had been on the verge of bombing those facilities. Lee then wrote the definitive book on the crisis and the deal. That deal fell apart 15 years ago, and North Korea has since tested both nuclear weapons and missiles of all ranges to deliver them. Lee has been meeting with North Korean officials for years to discuss the possibilities of a peaceful end to North Korea's nuclear weapon program. He shared the resulting insights with all who will listen, and today we're privileged to listen.
Thanks, Frank. Let me just say that I'm going to part company with my friend Wendy Sherman on some of this. The most important thing I'd leave you with is President Trump is an exception to President Trump's impulse not to do diplomacy is the North Korean situation. And to the extent that he is negotiating, I think he deserves our support. It is a rare exception, I would underscore. But then Wendy has to live in Washington, and I don't. So I'm going to take you down in the weeds and try to tell you the little I know about what's going on based on obviously talking to Americans, talking to Chinese, talking to Japanese, talking to South Korean officials who are doing this. Let's start in January 2017, a day after Kim Jong-un's 2017 New Year's Day speech. He gives one every year. When President-elect Donald Trump tweeted, "North Korea just stated it is in the final stages of developing a nuclear weapon capable of reaching parts of the United States. It won't happen." And everybody took that as a message that we were going to war, which it was not. Some of us did not think so, nor, more importantly, did the North Koreans. By stopping nuclear and missile testing, just short of having a proven thermonuclear device and an ICBM to deliver it to all the United States, Kim Jong-un made it possible for President Trump to get his wish. But only if the U.S. is prepared to sustain diplomatic give and take and live up to its commitments. Otherwise, Kim will resume testing. That's where we are. I know that's not common knowledge, but they don't have an ICBM yet, and they don't have a proven thermonuclear device, which gives us some incentive to keep going at the negotiating table. Now, Trump claims that economic sanctions forced the North Koreans to that table. More likely, they were induced by his frequently expressed wish to cut a deal, which he said often in the presidential campaign. It wasn't really noticed by the press, but some of us paid attention, and more importantly, so did the North Koreans. They also were impressed by his go-ahead within weeks of taking office for the first humanitarian aid given to the North in 5 years. Yes, President Trump did that. It wasn't noticed. By the way, it was aid that President Obama had authorized on his last day in office, after talking to Trump on several occasions about North Korea. I don't know if they cooked up the scheme in common. The North Koreans dismissed the war talk out of Washington. The press was full of that war talk as bluff after Trump authorized negotiations in the New York Channel starting in early spring, well before most of the war talk. The North Koreans and the Americans were negotiating. Again, unnoticed by the press for reasons I can't fathom. Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula depends a lot less on maintaining maximum pressure than on addressing what Kim Jong-un wants in negotiations. Now, observers, and you heard some of this from Wendy, speculate that what Kim wants from Trump is the end of the alliance with South Korea, the abandonment of the nuclear umbrella, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, a Marshall Plan, or somehow reunification with the South by the North winning the reunification battle, or written security assurances. To the contrary, what he wants is reconciliation with his lifelong foe, the lifelong foe of his country, an end to U.S. enmity, or what the North Koreans call the U.S. hostile policy. Based on what North Korean diplomats have been telling U.S. officials, and some of us ex-officials for years, reconciliation entails the following: normalization of political and economic relations, a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and ultimately an alliance like the one South Korea has with the United States, an alliance that would be backed by the continued U.S. troops presence on the Korean Peninsula. I know you haven't heard much of that, but I've heard it enough times in 25 years to think it is worth exploring. An end to U.S. enmity has been the Kim's aim for 30 years. Back in the Cold War, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, had played off China against the Soviet Union to maintain his freedom of maneuver. In 1988, that's a long time ago, in anticipation of the Soviet Union's collapse, yes, he knew what we didn't. He reached out to reconcile with the United States, South Korea, and Japan in order to avoid overdependence on China. North Korea's need has become all the greater as China's power has grown. From Pyongyang's vantage point, that aim, an end to enmity with the U.S., was the basis of the 1994 agreed framework that committed Washington to, and let me quote, move toward full normalization of political and economic relations. Notice, not diplomatic relations, political and economic relations, meaning an end to sanctions, a fundamental change in the relationship, and enmity. That's what it meant. That's what our negotiators understood it to mean. That's what the North Koreans meant by it. That's what some of us outsiders understood it to mean. It was also, by the way, the end of enmity was the essence of the September 2005 six-party joint statement, which bound Washington and Pyongyang under the Bush administration to, and let me quote again, respect each other's sovereignty, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize their relations subject to their respective bilateral policies, as well as to, and I quote again, negotiate a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. That's what President Bush agreed to back in 2005. For Washington, obviously the point of these agreements was an end to Pyongyang's nuclear programs. From 1994 to 2003, under the agreed framework, when the North had no nuclear weapons, had none, the North reprocessed no fissile material. You have to reprocess spent fuel in order to extract plutonium for weapons, and conducted just 2 test launches of medium and longer range missiles. In 1997, after Washington was slow to live up to the accord, the North began acquiring the means to enrich uranium. They were not enriching it yet. They were acquiring centrifuges and parts to make centrifuges, which you use to enrich uranium. It again shuttered its production of plutonium and halted missile and nuclear testing from 2007 to 2009. Both the 1994 and 2005 agreements with the North collapsed, however, when Washington did little to implement its commitment to reconcile, and Pyongyang, as you all know, reneged on denuclearization. What you don't often hear is we did nothing to change the relationship. President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo seem aware of Kim Jong-un's desire to end enmity and have taken important steps to address it. Steps, by the way, that have been criticized viscerally by most so-called experts. I say so-called because it's clear most of them do not have a clue what's going on or else hate it. What better way to demonstrate that than for Trump to sit down at the negotiating table with Kim on June 12th? You want to talk to your enemies. Sign a joint statement with him and suspend joint military exercises. Or to say, as the president has, that he is prepared to end the Korean War and to normalize relations, something his predecessors have never said. No Democrat, no Republican. Yes, I understand it's a different tale from what you're reading in the New York Times. I'm sorry, I worked there. They've got the story completely wrong. Ultimately, Trump may have to find a way to forge an alliance with Pyongyang alongside the one with Seoul. Or as Secretary Pompeo put it last June 7, and let me quote it, "We want to achieve a fundamentally different strategic relationship between our two countries," close quotes. That's the Secretary of State of the United States saying, we're at least thinking about an alliance. We understand what you've been saying. How else to reassure Kim that he will be secure enough to consider yielding his nuclear weapons? Now that past is prologue. Now the administration is said to want the North to provide a complete inventory of the North's nuclear assets, their facilities, their fissile material, their bombs. But that will only initiate a prolonged period of uncertainty with little benefit to the United States and Allied security as Washington tries to verify that inventory and clear up what will undoubtedly be discrepancies with U.S. intelligence estimates. In the meantime, North Korea will continue manufacturing fissile material and missiles. That to me makes no security sense. A better starting point for Washington is to induce North Korea to suspend production of fissile material and then suspend deployment of intermediate and intercontinental range missiles. To facilitate monitoring, Pyongyang will have to declare the location of all fissile material and missile production sites, not where the material is, but where the facilities are to make it. In his latest summit with Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un offered to dismantle the nuclear facilities at Yongbyon if Trump takes, and I quote, corresponding measures in accordance with the spirit of the June 12 U.S. DPRK joint statement. Denuclearization will not happen, Pyongyang has since made clear, unless Washington eases some sanctions and joins it and Seoul in a peace declaration committing to a peace process on the Korean Peninsula that reduces the risk of military clashes, especially in the West or Yellow Sea and the DMZ, and culminates in a treaty ending the Korean War. They don't want a treaty just yet. They understand many things have to happen before you can get a treaty. Now, critics claim that the peace declaration will open the way to the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Korea. But as I've suggested, that is not what the North says it wants. as the North Koreans have been telling Americans for over 2 decades, and as Kim Jong-un and his father both told South Korean presidents. They want the troops to remain, not to leave, if the relationship changes. Even if it should make such a demand to get the troops out, the United States and its ally, South Korea, can just simply say no. No deal. To the north, U.S. sanctions are evidence of enmity. They are not the source of economic growth. We don't and have never done much business with North Korea. When you have something called the Trading with the Enemy Act, you're telling them something. We haven't. We've suspended it twice and reinstated it twice. We can do it a third time. It's called diplomatic give and take for a reason. All take and no give won't work with North Korea. I've been in this for 30 years. It's never worked at all. Expecting the North to stop making fissile material and missiles, never mind hand over some of its nuclear assets without addressing its security needs, misconstrues the Singapore joint statement, which commits the North to, and I quote, work toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is, of course, our main aim. And at the same time commits the United States, and here I quote again, to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, that's our commitment, and to establish new U.S. DPRK relations. Those are their main aims. Without satisfying both sides, talks won't succeed. Secretary of State Pompeo, you will not know this, actually put the peace declaration on the negotiating table in his last visit to Pyongyang. So we're moving. But without a decision to offer sanctions relief, forthcoming talks with Kim Young-chol could end in failure. Pompeo told the UN General Assembly enforcement of UN Security Council sanctions must continue vigorously until we realize the fully final verified denuclearization. But in easing of US sanctions, he didn't say anything about that. He said it may be tied to substantial steps toward denuclearization. So there's a little leeway in our negotiating position. President Trump wants a second summit. My hunch is Pompeo is telling him it will be a failure if we do not commit to offer some exceptions to U.S. sanctions over the objections of Bolton and others. One obvious exception is this. If Americans dig up Korean War remains in the North, how else can we pay for hotel rooms, transportation, never mind demining and other equipment? There's an exception, folks. In conclusion, skeptics insist Kim will never keep its pledge to denuclearize. How do they know? How do they know? I don't know if they will or they won't. Nobody knows. I know how to find out. Diplomatic give and take with concrete proposals for reciprocal steps, and implementing what you agree to is the way to find out. Dismantling production facilities and verifying disarmament will take years. So will convincing steps to reconciliation. Only then will Kim reveal his willingness to give up all his nuclear weapons or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. We are fortunate to have William Hartung here today. An articulate policy analyst, he is one of the nation's leading experts on weapons sales. Bill is director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. He previously led the New America Foundation's American Strategy Program and the Arms Trade Resource Center of the World Policy Institute. His books include A Quick and Dirty Guide to War Profiteering in the Bush Administration, Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War, and Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military. Bill's prolific writings published widely and keeps readers regularly informed on weapons trafficking, one of the Coalition for Peace Action's priorities. Welcome to Princeton.
Thank you. Well, I'm honored to be here, especially in this illustrious roster of speakers. I always learn things from listening to my friend and neighbor, Lee Sigal. I'm so glad Ray Acheson is here to give us, I think, the big picture of what we need to be working on. It was wonderful to hear Ambassador Sherman, and of course, I'm glad I'm not the speaker who comes right before Reverend Jackson. I have a confession to make, which is that I was in a great quandary in preparing this talk, because I've given many talks about the military-industrial complex and painted an exquisite picture of exactly how powerful they are. And the only problem with that kind of talk is people go home and say, wow, it really is hopeless, isn't it? So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I am going to give an exquisite picture of the power of the nuclear-industrial complex, but I'm also going to talk about the fact that they're not all powerful. We've made progress in the past despite their efforts, and we'll make progress now and in the future despite their efforts. They just make it a lot harder. They're an obstacle to be overcome, not a roadblock that we can't get past. So, as you know, folks in this group probably know, the nuclear weapons lobby started at the very beginning. And in fact, the nuclear weapons lobby was one of the reasons Eisenhower gave his military-industrial complex speech. They were trying to press a new nuclear bomber on him, which he did not think was necessary. You had generals speaking out of school, contradicting his position on that. You had contractors putting ads in the newspaper about why we needed a new nuclear bomber. And then, of course, you had the whole missile gap debate, where he was put on the defensive, mostly by Democratic senators who were using that as a club to beat him and Nixon over the head with, and also a way to pave the way for increased military spending. So even before he gave his speech, he described the missile gap controversy as, quote, a useful piece of political demagoguery. And he also said, munitions makers are making tremendous efforts towards getting more contracts, and in fact seem to be exerting undue influence over the senators. Now that term undue influence was translated into unwarranted influence in the military-industrial complex speech, but you get a sense of how that idea got planted in his mind. The other thing that he talked about in the speech itself, his farewell address, was that one of the reasons we developed a permanent arms establishment in this country, instead of demobilizing after wars, was the nuclear weapons phenomenon itself. As he put it, we couldn't improvise the means of national defense when World War III could happen tomorrow. So there's a link between the nuclear weapons development and the development of a large military industry overall. So this is the part where I talk about how powerful they are, but don't take it too much to heart. One of the things that gives the nuclear industry power, as it does other weapons makers, is that they're sprawled out over the country, and they also play the jobs card relentlessly. So we have nuclear weapons laboratories, warhead facilities, missile bomber production sites, submarine bases, missile silos, kind of the whole complex related to nuclear weapons. In Washington State, California, New Mexico, Texas, Missouri, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, Georgia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, not to mention the subcontractors that are spread around the country. So that gives them a lot of clout with Congress. Members don't like to be viewed as voting against jobs in their state or district. And so that's one of the things that the weapons makers bring forward, not the security of the country, but the security of the jobs of our politicians. And they have many levers of influence in addition to the jobs and the spread of the weapons. The military industry spent $50 million in campaign contributions in the last 2 congressional cycles, mostly to members of the key committees who make these decisions. $500 million on lobbying in the last 4 years, and they have between 700 and 1,000 registered lobbyists in any given year, which is, in a good year, almost 2 for every member of Congress. There's the revolving door between the military and industry, which turns both ways. So in the Trump administration, for example, you have many of the top leaders coming straight from military industry. Secretary Mattis was on the board of General Dynamics. John Kelly worked with a private security contractor. The head of the Air Force was a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin. The second person at the Pentagon worked for Boeing on missile defense systems and is now the biggest advocate of the Space Force, which I'm not sure will ever come to be, but makes a great slogan at Trump rallies. Right after the wall, the chants are Space Force, Space Force. And Trevor Noah, that great political analyst, had one of his people go and interview Trump folks after these rallies where they were chanting Space Force. And he said, well, what is the Space Force? And they really didn't know. They just thought it sounded great and Trump wanted to do it and let's do it, So this is not one of the positives of Trump policy, unlike North Korea. And finally, when they wanted to appoint a Lockheed Martin executive to the number 3 position in the Pentagon, the late John McCain said, enough already with these arms executives coming into government. And Elizabeth Warren gave a speech on the floor of the Senate where she said, no taxpayer should have to wonder whether the top policymakers at the Pentagon are pushing defense products and foreign military sales for reasons other than the protection of the United States of America. No American should have to wonder whether the Defense Department is acting to protect the national interests of our nation or the financial interests of the 5 giant defense contractors. Unfortunately, despite the criticisms of McCain and Warren, this nomination sailed through by a vote of 81-7. So there's work to be done, is what I'm saying. And then my last part about the power of the industry before I talk about the vulnerabilities. They like caucuses. There's an ICBM caucus in the Senate made up of senators from the states where the ICBM silos are located. And they don't want, not only don't they want us to reduce ICBMs, they wouldn't even allow for the silos that were left empty by the New START agreement to be destroyed. They wanted them to be in what they called warm status. So if we built up again, the missiles would be based in their states. And then they said, well, what if we just did an environmental impact study about what would happen if we destroyed the silos? And the caucus said, oh no, that's a slippery slope, can't possibly do that. So the industry has them on their side. They also fund think tanks like the Center for Security Policy, National Institute for Public Policy, the Lexington Institute, all populated by analysts who never met a weapons system they didn't like. And so this is sort of their way of having an influence over the debate. It wouldn't be that convincing if the head of Lockheed Martin or Boeing got up in front of a podium and said, I think we need more nuclear weapons. I think everybody would realize that was self-interested. But if they fund a think tank with a person who puts on a suit and seems like an expert saying the same thing, it goes a little further. And many times these people are not identified as being on the payroll of the contractors when they are quoted in the media. So anyway, so that's the challenging news. But there's many examples, even in the difficult times that we've been through lately, of the arms lobby not getting what it wants. And I think that will be the case going forward. Republicans rejoiced about this huge tax cut that Trump pushed through, but it's not automatically good news for the military industry because the deficit's growing. There's deficit hawks in Congress on the Republican side who don't like to see those numbers go this high. Some of them in the past have spoken out in favor of caps on the military budget. And now with the Democratic House that includes Adam Smith running the Armed Services Committee, who has questioned the nuclear modernization program, the necessity of nuclear weapons, who's talked about reining in the Pentagon, who's recently joined the efforts to stop U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. I think the industry may face a tougher road in Congress than they may have anticipated. And in the past, well, I should say one other thing. This nuclear buildup is so expensive, it's going to bump up against other programs. You know, so the Air Force wants to build a new nuclear bomber, a new intercontinental ballistic missile, the F-35 combat aircraft, which is the most expensive weapons program ever undertaken by the Pentagon, a new refueling aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones. So there's going to be competition among the contractors and also between the services for, you know, for the Pentagon, no amount is never enough, and they can always plan for more than the budget will allow. And in the Navy, they want to build very expensive submarine launched ballistic missiles and the submarines that they go on, versus all these surface ships that the Navy and the contractors want. 350, which is a ridiculous number, but nonetheless their goal. And if you look at the Space Force, which Smith and others are against, there's a split down the middle. Some of the companies that make military satellites and space weapons are all on board with this. Mike Rogers, who represents Huntsville, Alabama, which is kind of the, you know, military space capital of the world. They're all for it. But the Aerospace Industries Association, which is the biggest contractor lobby, when they asked, you know, the head of that organization, he said, well, I don't know, we like to build stuff, and this sounds like a big bureaucracy to me. If the more that goes into bureaucracy, the less money we're going to get. So there's a fight within the industry over the Space Force. And this has been true on many other issues. And even when the lobby is united, as they were when budget caps were imposed on the Pentagon in 2011, they started a big campaign saying, oh, if you cap the Pentagon budget, we're going to lose 1 million jobs nationwide. And you know, they were going all over Capitol Hill, and they had a study showing how many jobs in each district and so forth. So the caps were not fully implemented because they used the war budget to throw a lot of money at, and the war budget was not capped. So, but they certainly probably lost about 200 to 300 billion over 5 years from what they hoped to get based on the Pentagon's plans. So they spent less on the Pentagon, and jobs actually went up. They didn't go down. We didn't lose 1 million jobs. And even some conservative members said, you know, well, I don't want to see your lobbyists anymore to these companies. You're not credible. I don't believe you people. So that effort backfired. In the past, these jobs campaigns have been quite successful. So there's that element. And then I think more broadly, there is war fatigue in the country. You know, Trump, you may remember back in the dark ages of 2015 and 2016, or maybe those were the bright ages. You know, he criticized the Iraq War, and he used it to beat up on Hillary, he used it to beat up on Jeb Bush. He said it was a fiasco. He said we waste trillions of dollars we could have used to rebuild America. And of course, he's followed up on none of that. But I think the interesting point is that it resonated with his base. A lot of them were vets who had been through these wars. They had been treated badly when they came back, but their needs weren't being met and so forth. And I think there was a feeling among many of these people that some investments had to be made to create jobs for them to replace the jobs they were losing. So what I'm saying is that I think depending how it is put forward, I think an initiative to reduce Pentagon spending, and particularly the most egregious and unnecessary portion of it, which is the nuclear weapons buildup, could have resonance in a bipartisan fashion. So my last point is just, you know, what can we expect with the new Congress? And I do think certainly we have better leverage to block bad ideas. I think in terms of reducing Pentagon spending itself, there'll be a split in the Democratic caucus because some of them will have facilities in their states or districts. Others will view it as, you know, as excessive, the current level of spending. And you will have some conservative Republicans, deficit hawks, although fewer after this election in some ways, who will say, well, you know, this is out of control, and we have to rein it in. So I think there'll be some leverage to be had, and we'll have to see how far we can go with that. But on the nuclear weapons issue itself, Representative Smith, who will run Armed Services, is against the withdrawal from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, is against the new nuclear weapon that the administration wants to build, and thinks a $1.2 trillion buildup of nuclear weapons over the next 3 decades is, to put it mildly, excessive. I would also say unnecessary. I think we do have a lot of possibilities in this environment. Obviously, we are challenged on many fronts, not just the nuclear weapons front. But I do believe we can come together and begin to change the direction of this country and begin to rebuild our democracy. And I think getting rid of nuclear weapons will be an important, integral part of that. Thank you.
Thanks to Bill Hartung. I really like the way you had some signs of hope in there for us too, some good organizing handles to grab onto and move the ball forward. It's now, I'm pleased to introduce the person who's going to introduce our third speaker on this panel, but before I turn the mic over to her, Nikki Von Auer is our Assistant Director. She's been in that role since mid-January. And let me say, just in front of all of you, an event like this has an enormous amount of detail involved. Enormous. And it ranges from things like creating the program that you were handed when you came here, to arranging for the speaker's lunch, to arranging travel. Oh, so many details. This woman to my left has done a spectacular job on all of that. Nikki to introduce our third speaker on this panel.
Yes, I'm very happy to be introducing Ray Acheson. She is the director of Reaching Critical Will, where she provides analysis, research, and advocacy across a range of disarmament and arms control issues. She leads the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, their work on stigmatizing war and violence. As her role on the steering group for the international campaign to ban nuclear weapons, she was part of the Nobel Peace Prize winning effort in 2017 to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons passed at the United Nations. Please welcome Ray Acheson.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. Since it's the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I thought I would actually take us back to the beginning of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was founded in 1915 during World War I. I'm not exactly sure how they did it, but women from around the world, from countries that were at war with each other and from neutral countries, managed to somehow organize, before the internet, to convene in The Hague during World War I to set out a plan for the end of the war and to prevent future conflicts like it. And this was an incredible peace plan that involved many different elements, from women's enfranchisement for the right to vote and for political participation, to disarmament plans, to the structures of the international system that were actually put in place through the League of Nations and then later the United Nations. So there's a rich history to this organization. But one of the things that they said at their founding meeting in 1915 was that the reckless sacrifice of human life and the destruction of so much that humanity has labored through the centuries to build must never be repeated. Now, of course, it has been repeated. And at that point in 1915, they didn't know that the atomic bomb was coming. Maybe they couldn't even imagine that there would be a single weapon in which so much horror could be imparted. Or maybe they did. Maybe they could imagine that, because they were very concerned about the military-industrial complex that Bill Hartung just spoke about. they did recognize the private profits that accrue from the great armament factories, which they called them in 1915, and the powerful hindrance that this posed to the abolition of war. So I wanted to start with this because the process to ban nuclear weapons that I'm going to speak about is really a challenge to all weapons, and a challenge to war fundamentally, as well as to this military-industrial complex, which is a driving force for conflict. The ban on nuclear weapons achieved last year built on decades of activism that has come before it. The idea of banning the bomb is certainly nothing new. But its story really starts, the story that I want to tell, the piece of it that I want to tell, starts in 2007. And the reason for this is, well, there's several reasons that I'll go through quickly. For one thing, ICANN was born in 2007. This is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. This is the civil society coalition that now has over 500 partner organizations in over 100 countries. I'm sure that many of you were part of this process through different organizations and different work streams. But ICANN was born in 2007 in Australia. And it was founded actually by two women who were also members of WILP, along with several of their colleagues back in Australia. And they involved the doctors group, IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And they started ICANN as a project to try and revitalize the anti-nuclear movement. Since the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons have not been on the radar for many people the way that they were before. We all know this, we recognize this, we go to our meetings, we try and bring new people along to talk about nuclear weapons and why they're relevant to our current lives. And it's been increasingly harder to do that since the end of the Cold War. So one of the initiatives with ICANN was to attract students to the movement, starting with medical students in Australia. But it quickly spread around the world to become what it is today, which is an intergenerational global movement against nuclear weapons. The other thing that was happening around the mid-2000s was the prohibition on cluster munitions, which followed on the prohibition on landmines, which had taken part in the 1990s. And so what was interesting about these is that these were international agreements negotiated by the majority of countries in the world, but without the participation or support of the major users and producers of these weapons. Countries like the United States, countries like China and Russia opposed the development of these treaties. But civil society worked with like-minded governments to lead a process to ban these weapons because of the indiscriminate harm they cause to civilians, because of the contamination of land, and because of their long-lasting intergenerational effects that they could have by being remnants from conflicts around the world. All of this sounds pretty apt for nuclear weapons as well. And so with the lessons of these two treaties, ICANN, situated as a new campaign, really looking for something specific to work towards, thought this might be a good time for us to see if governments would also be willing to do a treaty on nuclear weapons like the ones they've done on landmines and cluster bombs. It turns out there were a few governments that were interested in this idea. These were governments who have been good faith players in the international system that has been set up to regulate and control nuclear armaments, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Countries that led that process, like Ireland, countries that were invested as a principled position against nuclear weapons, like Mexico and most of Latin America. And countries that were really frustrated with what was happening internationally. In the middle of the 2010 NPT review conference, which is supposed to review the implementation of that treaty, they did reach agreement on future steps for nuclear disarmament. But in the middle of that conference, the Obama administration announced its billions and billions of dollars that it was going to spend on modernizing the nuclear arsenal, which it had made as a deal in exchange for the Senate's ratification of the New START Treaty. And so we faced a situation where countries were coming together in the United Nations, rolling up their sleeves, trying to negotiate commitments for nuclear disarmament to finally get the nuclear armed states to comply with their agreed obligation to eliminate their nuclear weapons. And instead, the US administration, as well as the Russians, the Chinese, and every other nuclear armed state were planning to refurbish or modernize their nuclear arsenals, which was going to extend their lives into the future indefinitely. So there was frustration, but there was also, like I said, these lessons of these other treaties, and there was a willingness of some countries in the world to do something about it and to work with civil society to do it. And we'd learned how to do this through the bans on landmines and cluster munitions. And with those treaties, one of the first things that they set out to do was to change the discourse on these weapons, to take the power away from those who justified their use in conflict. And so we sought out to do exactly the same thing with nuclear weapons. Once again, this isn't necessarily new. It's building on the discourse that was dominant in the 1960s and the 1980s on nuclear weapons. All the environmental studies looking at how nuclear weapons would affect the climate, would affect food production, looking at nuclear weapons and radiation, how they impact human bodies. But all of these studies were updated, and they were brought to a new generation of diplomats and activists. And so it revitalized this discourse around the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And a few governments hosted international conferences. Norway, Mexico, and Austria convened global gatherings of the Red Cross, of all the governments in the world, of ICANN and other civil society groups, to really talk about what nuclear weapons are in reality, what they do to human beings, what they do to the environment if they're used. And part of this is about stigmatizing the weapons. Instead of allowing them to be talked about as tools for strategic stability, as deterrents that prevent war, we looked at nuclear weapons in reality. We heard directly from survivors of nuclear weapons as well, which was another lesson that we learned from banning landmines and cluster munitions, the importance of first-hand accounts. Many of you may have been fortunate enough to hear Hibakusha speak before, the atomic bomb survivors from Japan. We also engaged with survivors from nuclear testing, from First Nations people in Canada and the United States around uranium mining and testing in the United States, First Nations in Australia, where the British tested their bombs, in the Pacific, where the French and the Americans tested their bombs. And so we engaged directly with these communities and made their stories and their testimonies stand up to this discourse of deterrence, of that these weapons are meant to never be used. It's hard to say that to the face of someone who has experienced these weapons firsthand. We also learned about the strategies of divestment, and this gets directly to what Bill was talking about. With the landmine and cluster bomb treaties, both of those agreements led to very powerful divestment campaigns where people were able to convince their banks as well as major financial institutions to withdraw money from the production of these weapons. And so we thought we could definitely do the same thing with nuclear weapons. If we're stigmatizing these weapons, then surely people will want to divest. And one of the things that we heard when we started calling banks and pension funds in the mid-2000s was, well, yes, we do divest from landmines, we do divest from cluster bombs. These weapons are illegal. Nuclear weapons are not. And so that was sort of when we knew that we were on the right track, and that we needed to categorically make sure that nuclear weapons were illegal and considered illegal socially and politically and economically, and not just amongst states. So we convened, in addition to these conferences hosted by Norway, Mexico, and Austria looking at the humanitarian impacts, at the same time we were also convening groups of countries within regions and across regions to talk about solutions. To not just look at the humanitarian impacts, but to talk about what legal and political strategies we might need in order to stand up to the current situation and make a change. And over a number of years, this process of meeting with governments, convening governments, and writing papers and strategizing was that we really could pursue a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. The tricky part for many governments was this idea of doing it without the nuclear armed states. They knew that this would be difficult, to say the least, and they weren't sure that it would have an impact. And so once again, we looked to the treaties that banned cluster bombs and landmines and looked at the impact that they had when they didn't have the support of the major users and producers. Well, to this day, not all of those countries have joined those treaties, and yet for the most part, those treaties are being complied with even by governments that have remained outside of them. So for example, the United States doesn't use landmines anymore in conflict. The only place that it still has landmines actively is in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The final producer of cluster bombs in the United States actually shut its production line in 2016. It announced that it was done making cluster bombs because there was no more economic incentive to do so. At the United Nations, countries that still haven't joined these treaties deliver explanations year after year of what they're doing to be in line with these instruments, even though they refuse to join them. So they have given such and such money to mine clearance, they give this much money to victim assistance, they have moratoriums on production, they don't sell the weapons anymore, they don't use the weapons anymore. So countries are coming in line with the agreements, even if they have this principled rejection of the instrument because they're just, sticking to what they came up with 10 years ago out of their own ego, more or less. And so we look to this as an example of how a nuclear ban treaty could possibly have the same impact through the stigmatization process, through making it normative that nuclear weapons are rejected by the civilized international community, and to take away the power of the justifications that have lived for so long in our minds about why these weapons are necessary or useful for security. It wasn't an easy road, though, to get countries to publicly come forward to say that they wanted to do this because they were afraid. And rightfully so. In 2016, that was the first time that we had countries go on the record saying that they wanted to do this. They did that at a United Nations meeting, and it was a meeting that the nuclear armed states had boycotted. They boycotted, by the way, all of the humanitarian conferences, refusing to even show up to talk about nuclear weapons, and they boycotted the meeting at the UN, which discussed the best way forward, which is when we had the majority of countries go on record to say they wanted to negotiate a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. And it was after that meeting that the pressure came to bear. So in October of 2016, countries voted at the UN of whether they wanted to start negotiations on this treaty. And in advance of that vote, the Obama administration sent a memo to all of its allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to instruct them not to vote in favor of starting negotiations, to instruct them to stay away from negotiations if it did go through, and to never join the treaty if it was adopted. The French and the British also got involved in the pressure, mostly using their former colonies. So for example, Francophone Africa came under extreme pressure from the French government to stay away from negotiations. Fortunately, we'd done years of work in the region to build up support for the treaty, to build up understanding of why this was relevant for global security, for African politics, and Africa is already a regional nuclear weapon-free zone, so it was very much consistent with their position to be in support of a treaty like this. And in building up these arguments, we also build up networks of support so that when the pressure did come to bear, there were other governments that could stand by them. There were civil society groups locally and globally that could speak to their government and encourage them to participate and urge them to stay on the right side of history. And so in October 2016, the UN did vote by overwhelming majority to start negotiations on this treaty, which began in March of 2017. And the beginning of negotiations at the UN on this treaty was, there was a remarkable incident in which the US ambassador, Nikki Haley, actually stood outside of the UN General Assembly Hall with a smattering of NATO states to protest the negotiations going on inside and to say that the countries inside didn't understand security and didn't have real security interests that they needed to protect. And there was all this language about these being unserious countries. And it was remarkable, not just for the language that she spoke, but also for the fact that the US government was standing outside of the UN protesting, while inside, a bunch of activists were working with other governments to negotiate new international law. So it was a real turning of events for us. And the negotiations, there were some tricky spots, but overall, it's really amazing what you can get done when the nuclear armed states aren't in the room, telling you that you can't do this and you can't do that. It's a categorical prohibition on nuclear weapons. The treaty outlines all of the activities that you can't do, which is basically everything. The only thing that you can do with nuclear weapons under this treaty is get rid of them. And so in addition to the prohibitions, there's also space provided for the nuclear armed states to join and get rid of their nuclear weapons. We didn't negotiate anything specific for this because we knew that the nuclear armed states, if they're going to get rid of their nuclear weapons, will want to negotiate that themselves. So what the treaty does is provide space and provide the wide parameters that this has to be verifiable and monitored by the international community and agreed with the other states parties of the treaty. And so what we hope is that through the process of stigmatization, through the process of normative change that we're already beginning to see, the nuclear armed states will eventually be compelled to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Now, of course, this does not happen overnight. This treaty is not the end-all be-all. It is not the ultimate solution. But it is a piece of hope. And it's something that was created by governments and by activists and by the Red Cross, people, individuals, and systems that actually do support the elimination of nuclear weapons. And from the perspective of survivors, the process was led by, engaged with survivors, women, queer people. The Global South led this process. This is a really unique experience to have happened at the United Nations, where usually the terms are dictated by the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. This really turned that over. This was an instance of people standing up to those structures and trying something new. So even though it has not solved everything, it is something that can give us hope for how things can be done and how the international community can move together collectively to build security that is meaningful for all people. And I think we just have to keep doing more and more and more of that type of activism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. I thought that was truly outstanding and inspirational. And I liked your line about you can get so much done when the nuclear weapon states aren't in the room. Isn't that the case? Jim, you're 6? All right, that may be as many as we can get through. So let's hope that we have good progress here. And again, 1 question per questioner and make it as succinct as you can. Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you to the entire panel. And my question is for Dr. Sigal. Could you please comment on the different position that the Trump administration is taking per the Iranian nuclear deal and the negotiation with North Korea?
Well, the contradiction's pretty obvious. But if you look at President Trump's record, he doesn't seem to like any treaty that somebody else negotiated. Which is one of the hopeful signs on North Korea, because there is no treaty in place or agreement in place that anybody else has negotiated. And again, you know, you worry where Bolton will push the other remaining treaty, the START treaty. I think that's in trouble. I worry about that a lot. But Bolton has so far failed in his efforts to block negotiations on North Korea. And let's hope that process continues.
Okay, questioner 2.
For anybody who wants to take the question, the UN did a study one year of 211 nations, and the United States ranked 15th from the bottom in corruption. Another year they did 198 nations, and Russia ranked 168th from the bottom. 80% of the CIA is embedded in 17 defense contractors. If 250, according to Reverend Moore, of those atomic nuclear weapons go off, none of us will survive. And the chances of an accidental war are 100%. In education, we ranked 23rd, 35th in math, spending more than any other nation. In medicine, we ranked 38th.
Okay, Ron, you have to get to your question now.
Okay, the question is, how do we change our culture of corruption, and in particular to the media, and put nuclear disarmament on the front page and not sexual misogyny, which I am not guilty of because of my mother?
Who would like to go first?
Well, I think next year's conference is going to address that. But I think corruption is only part of the problem. I mean, there's different ways of defining it. But certainly the process of campaign contributions, of fake contractors sucking up money, of destroying the debate, and so forth, is an element of corruption. But I think, beyond that, people want to be safe. And so the question is, can we put forward a vision that makes it clear to people that you can be safe with less military spending, fewer nuclear weapons? I think if we could get that message and people were to take it in, I think all the corrupt practices in the world wouldn't be able to stop us. So that's my short answer. But as I said, Bob is now going to do a conference on this next year. So,
Gee, thanks for giving us the theme.
he can finish the job.
Anybody else? Ray, say something.
No, but I agree with Bill, but I guess I would just say I'm really glad that misogyny and sexual violence are on the front page.
Amen. Okay, 3.
While I'm inspired by Ray's presentation and hope that Democratic presidential candidates early on in the primary process will be put on record on that, my question is going to be on North Korea. So Lee, if you could walk us through what led the North Korean government back in '88 to ratify the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and then backpedal, what were the internal dynamics? And taking a page from Bill's book about the military-industrial complex, what is the strength within the North Korean political system today of those who have now made a living building these things? How can they be pried away from that simply by a whim of the chief leader? What room really is there for this to go backsliding again on the Pyongyang side?
Let me answer the second question first. First of all, we don't know enough about the way the higher end process in North Korea works. There's a rather good book called Inside the Red Box that teases out some of this. But I would question putting our presumptions onto North Korea when it comes to how their system works. This is an extremely top-down regime, one that actually has no precedent. Even the Soviet Union had a collective leadership for most of the time after Stalin. This is not like that. And you might scoff at the whims of the leader, but the whims of the leader can make themselves felt in that system in a way that no other system has it. So I would not consider that you would worry about a military-industrial complex in North Korea. Indeed, there is some evidence that the military is more concerned with building up conventional forces than nuclear forces, which was, of course, the case in the United States for many years and still is. So there is some divide there, but we don't know enough to reach firm conclusions about any of that. As to what happened with the NPT, basically the North Koreans wanted help with nuclear reactors for power, and maybe as a hedge for nuclear weapons. And so when they approached the Russians for this, the Russians said, you have to sign on to the NPT, and the US was backing the Russian view. Remember, this was a different era in Russia than we have now. It was changing. And we don't know where the North Koreans ultimately end up, as I've tried to stress with you. It's an open question whether they will reverse themselves. I would be surprised if their interest in nuclear power as opposed to nuclear weapons won't resurface. After all, it was a part of the two prior agreements with us. And it's important to understand that it wasn't just giving them light water reactors. To run a light water reactor, you need outside expert help, both in providing the fissile material to run it, low enriched uranium, in providing technical advice, because the reactors would be an American model reactor, probably a Westinghouse reactor. It certainly was in the prior agreements. And to do that meant that you would have technical engagement of a high order of magnitude. And if what the North Koreans are really about, as I suspect, is a fundamental change in relationship with us, having Americans run around their nuclear power plants was a critical part of why they wanted American assistance in building light water reactors. We don't, again, know for sure, but there is certainly a lot of evidence, and I might add that our negotiators believe that was the case.
Question or four? Here we go. Zia, we'll get you on the stack too.
Well, thank you all for your great talks. That was very enlightening. I would like to know what you think are the main forces in this country that are opposed to peace negotiations, and especially a peace treaty in North Korea. It seems to me the Koreans generally would like to be reunited and have peace in their peninsula, but there are forces in this country, people in this country, who don't want that.
Well, I'd be careful about assuming reconciliation is what the two Korean governments want. I do think in the hearts of a lot of South Koreans, their kin are in the north, to some extent still alive. But ever since Kim Dae-jung gave a speech in Berlin back years ago, the aim of the two governments has been reconciliation, not reunification. Reunification has a particular meaning in the Korean context. It means the collapse of North Korea and its absorption by South Korea. The notion that South Koreans would, over time, ally themselves as individuals with the regime in North Korea is simply not comprehensible to anybody, I suspect, in the North Korean leadership, never mind to most of us. So I think that part of it. Now, you asked another piece of the question, and I may have lost it. Would you help me?
Who in our country would be opposed?
Oh, who is opposed? Well, look, we still have a lot of people with a Cold War mentality. North Korea is a truly distasteful, actually hateful regime when you look at it. I mean, we are not playing with a nice regime. We understand that, those of us who are involved. If you've been there, you've seen it up close and personal. So it is perfectly understandable for people to distrust anything the North Koreans are telling us. And, you know, the history is that they didn't live up to their end of the deal any more than we did. So there is reason for strong skepticism. I think within the military there are some people who want to keep our position in Korea the way it was and don't quite appreciate that the North Koreans actually would like that. Again, for reasons of skepticism. After all, the fundamental problem in the military's view is not North Korea, it's China. And the role of the US on the Korean Peninsula and on the Japanese islands is, number one, to deal with the looming possible threat from China. So anything that calls into question the US military presence becomes a problem. And I think many military officers are unfamiliar with what the North Korean position might be. I would say that was not true of our commander in Korea. Our last commander in Korea understood this, was fully in favor of the North-South military agreements that eased tensions. So again, I would not assume, I think the problem is so-called experts really don't know enough about what North Korea might want, and we can't be sure until we test it at the negotiating table. I can't tell you for sure this is what they mean. They mean what they say. We have to find out.
I would like to ask if there is a possibility that the Korean, North and South Korean could ever get together, or if that would even be helpful.
As I say, the future is hard to determine, but right now the view is that the only way they could reunify is the collapse of North Korea. And that obviously is unacceptable in Pyongyang and is not particularly desired among some of the younger people in South Korea because, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty attached to what would happen. The German experience is not a totally solitary one if you look at what's going on politically and economically in the eastern part of Germany compared to the western part. So I think the answer is we don't know down the long run. As far as I can see, the answer is they're not going to get together. And by the way, the history of Korea is one in which there were very short periods of time in which there was one Korea. There were 3 separate kingdoms. I mean, those of you who know the history better than I will know that there was seldom one Korea. The most prominent time there was one Korea was under Japanese occupation, which is not exactly the model for either North or South Korea.
And if I could just add one thought before we get to Dr. Meehan for the final question, and that's that I'm part of calls every 2 weeks, national conference calls, to sort of have a sense of cohesiveness to the national effort for supporting the Korea peace process. And one thing that I've really noticed that has stood out is how assertive, especially President Moon, but also Mr. Kim, have been in seeking to defuse the tensions between the two of them. And I think that's a very, very hopeful sign. And so, you know, there's great progress that's been made. In fact, Mr. Moon says that, Mr. Kim says that if a peace agreement is declared, and Dr. Sigal made a good distinction there, declaration is different than reaching that final treaty, but it starts a process. Mr. Kim has told Mr. Moon that he doesn't intend to try to force a U.S. withdrawal of U.S. troops. And so I think there's a lot of signs of hope here if we're willing to do our share, and that's the missing piece. North Korea has done way more to defuse this crisis than the U.S. has.
By the way, as I tried to suggest in my talk, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, said the same thing about U.S. troops to Kim Dae-jung back a couple of decades ago. This is not new.
Dr. Meehan.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up with a question about the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty and what can now be done in the United States. I mean, this is a peace group, and there are peace groups in towns and cities across the United States. And so one of the questions I have is how I can and the activists in this room can try and think of what kinds of steps can be taken in this country to begin the kind of debate that would make the Prohibition Treaty a more important part of the political debate here. Red?
Great question. That was the second part of my talk that I didn't have time for. I saw the 1 minute notice and I was, wow. So there's a few different things. One is the divestment work that I spoke of. There's a project called Don't Bank on the Bomb. The information is all online at don'tbankonthebomb.com. It lists every company that is involved in producing nuclear weapons and every bank and pension fund and financial institution that is giving money to those companies. So you can go online, find out if your personal bank is involved in investing in nuclear weapons, if your pension fund is involved, etc., and make some calls. See if you can get the bank to change its policy. We've had a number of banks throughout Europe already changing their policies, regardless of whether their government supports the treaty or not. It doesn't matter. Nuclear weapons are now prohibited under international law. The treaty will be entered into force within the next year and a half, probably. And so it's just a matter of calling up and seeing if you can get your bank to change or threaten to withdraw your money. As far as I know in the US, there's so far only one bank that has a very clear no investments in nuclear weapons policy, and that's Amalgamated Bank. I don't know if you have that in Jersey, but it's in New York and a few other states. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and it's a great conversation to have with your family and your friends as well. ICANN's also working on the city level, too, in countries that don't yet support the treaty. So across Europe and the US and the nuclear armed states, we have a city's appeal that you can download it off the ICANN website. And it's very simple. It's about working with your city councilors to get them to issue a resolution or a statement or however city council works to say that the city supports the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and wants the government to join the treaty. So that's another great way to have debates at the city level, to raise awareness, to have op-eds in local newspapers. And some major cities have already joined this. Toronto, my hometown, I'm proud to say, is part of this. Los Angeles as well. Melbourne and Sydney, both in Australia, even though the Australian government doesn't support it. Madrid as well, just a couple of days ago. So this is a growing thing as well. Parliamentary debates or congressional debates are another thing. This might work better in other countries, although now maybe there will be some hope for reinvesting in action at Congress here, but certainly across Europe and in Canada, we've had parliamentary debates, and that's another great way to make this, to revive this discussion and make it an issue that people think about as being relevant for elections. There's also the work on discourse change, the challenge to these concepts, these long-held concepts of deterrence and strategic stability that have gone for so long in academia and in just our general understanding and awareness of nuclear weapons that goes unchallenged. Or if you do challenge it, you're not considered to be a credible part of the apparatus. Especially in academics. And so I think if you're in those realms, working in those realms, challenging that, encouraging students to challenge that is really significant as well. And then of course there's work around direct action and protests that can be done for anybody that's interested in that. And that can, we just did a huge action, ICANN coordinated a huge global action on the 26th of September against one of the banks that has major investments in nuclear weapons, BNP Paribas. So all around the world, ICANNers went to the bank's headquarters in their countries and did some direct action. Some of them climbed up to roofs and dropped banners. Others just knocked on the door and handed over a piece of paper to say what they were protesting. So there's all kinds of things that are going on, and that we definitely need people to be working on with us. And I think the thing about the nuclear ban treaty is it does provide a tool. It's something new that we can talk about. It's a piece of progress that we can say, we now have a treaty that makes it illegal and our government is outside of it. And so I think that that's regardless of whether you think it's impactful on the US government in this moment, I think what it's useful for, undeniably, is that it can be something that changes the conversation.
Thank you. And just one PS to that. Ed Aguilar out of our Pennsylvania office in Philadelphia has helped spearhead, and I see Bob Smith is here from Brandywine Peace Community, so there's a whole coalition of groups that's been formed in Philadelphia to do exactly the kind of campaign that you mentioned. And so again, thanks for your inspiration and for your leadership, and thanks to the wonderful expertise that both of you gentlemen have led to this. Let's show our panel again some appreciation.